somehow linked with the first 2 points. The modernists highly believed that since the issues they are focusing on are taken up from our real lives, therefore the language which we use should also be the language that often people speak in their daily lives. So instead of going with a use of overtly dramatic language, they prefer to use a language which remained uniformed for the masses. I would like to take up my example of love, that the word love, when we talk about a word love, it has different meaning for different people, yet language coercively subsumes these different experiences under the same word. Modernist poetry veers away from the perpetrated literal overt language, and it relies rather on suggestions and allusions. If we can take the example of a poem by T.S. Eliot, which is Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, if we look at the first line, "Let us walk then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky," this gives us an idea of love, but the very next line, it shatters the entire image, which is, the line is, "like a patient etherized on the table." Hence, this language rightly brings to the masses the conditions that prevailed when the two world wars took place. That yes, people will, the lovers or the people will hold their hands together, they will walk out in the roads when the evening is spread out against the sky, but the atmosphere is as sick as that of a hospital where we see patients etherized on a table.
Absolutely. So we see that language here is being used to map a very complex experience. The realization of the complexity of reality is what modernism brings to us and the subsequent schools of criticism and the subsequent theories of art. So we see here that there is one emotion that in literal language is mentioned as love, but it can have many complex, negative and even clinical associations, as we see in T.S. Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Therefore, we see how they focus on the limitedness of language, the limitedness of everyday experience, and try to compensate for this limitedness through the expansion of experience and the mapping of complexities in art. Let us then look at the next slide. T.S. Eliot was one of the most influential critics of modernism, and two of his essays, the first one, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which was published in 1919, as well as Hamlet and His Problems, which was published in the same year, have had a seminal effect on the practical critics and the new critics. In fact, for writing these two essays, T.S. Eliot is sometimes also referred to himself as a new critic. Let us look at the next slide. Here we have pointed out which are the two main ideas that T.S. Eliot presents in each of these essays. The first essay is Tradition and the Individual Talent. In this essay, Eliot advocated a closely analytical and objective criticism which situated literary works alongside one another in the context of tradition. Before Eliot started writing, the trend of criticism focused on biographical or historical criticism, that is, focusing on the life of the author. Where is he in his life stage? Where is his maturity as an artist when he is writing a particular work of art? And therefore, criticism tried to focus on how these life stages or this level of psychological maturity, artistic maturity, is being replicated in his work. Historical criticism tried to see how the conditions of a particular time in a particular country were being replicated in a work of art. Eliot, however, begs to differ from this. He says that literary history and literary criticism has a logic of its own, and therefore all the works that have been written in literature so far are an organized composite unit. Therefore, every new work that enters this literary landscape will be influenced by each of the works in this landscape, as well as it will alter this landscape in turn. Therefore, any work of art should be seen not in a narrow historical context of biography and history of the times, but it should be seen in a broader historical context of literary history and how this work shows an influence of tradition at the same time it ends up altering the tradition. Therefore, according to Eliot, a perfect artist was an artist who had the most pronounced sense of history, or as he calls it, historical sense. That is, he is truly aware of all the works written in European literature and the literature of his own country when he is writing his own work. The second essay that we have is called Hamlet and His Problems. In this essay, Eliot introduced the very famous notion of the objective correlative. In short, what this notion means is that every sensation, every feeling, and every impression that the poet is trying to convey should have a correlating object, image, or chain of events that is concrete in nature, so that the reader is also conveyed which sensations, which emotions, or what kind of complex experience is the artist trying to replicate in his work. This notion had a very important impact on the school of new criticism, and therefore we shall discuss it in detail when we come to the tenets of new criticism. Having discussed the influence of modernism, let us now go to how the school of formalism influenced practical criticism. Let us go to the next slide. The influence of formalism can be seen in two ways. First was formalism's focus on form rather than content. This idea has been summed up very well in Viktor Shklovsky's lines. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object in itself is not important. This was published in the book Art as Technique in 1917. Viktor Shklovsky was one of the leading Russian formalists, and here he is bringing to light the fact that the thrust of criticism shifted from what is expressed in a work of art, that is the content or message of a work of art, to how is it actually expressed in a work of art. Therefore, the focus was on the form and not the content. What constitutes the form of any literary work? It is the language that is used, the literary artifices that are used, the figures of speech that have been used, and therefore they believe that if one tries to study objectively this formal aspects of a work of art, then we will be able to gainfully arrive not only at the message, but one will also be able to point out how is it that each poem in itself constitutes a unique aesthetic experience. The second point that influenced the school of practical criticism was difference between literal and literary language. We have already discussed this point in some detail. Let us look at what one more formalist critic, Roman Jakobson, has to say about it. He says that literary studies must engage in objective scholarly analysis of verbal art. This was published in the book Linguistics and in the essay Linguistics and Poetics in 1958. Although this is a later essay, it very usefully shows us the major thrust of the formalist school of criticism. One of the major advantages or contributions of the formalist school of criticism was that it divided language into structures and functions. As some of you might have studied, if you are students of linguistics, Roman Jakobson talks about how language has different functions like the referential function, the emotive function, the expressive function, etc. and that with each kind of function, the form or the style will change. Therefore, when the focus is on the referential function of language, that is, the speaker is focusing on what is being said, then the language used will be literal in nature. However, when the author is focusing on the expressive function or the emotive function of language, then he will focus on how he is conveying his message. I think we can take an example from ordinary life here, that in any situation where one person is apologizing to another person, the focus is always on how the apology is conveyed rather than what exactly the apology is. And here we can see how the different functions of language play in different ways and they create different messages within themselves. So the important insight that formalism brought was not only number one, that language can change that language is different for different functions, but secondly, language can change the very nature of the message. Therefore, if my focus is on the emotions, if my focus is on the response of the receiver of my message or on convincing the receiver, then I should change the method in which I present the material. What it brings to the school of criticisms is that it shows us how the paraphrase of poetry is not a useful exercise in itself, because paraphrasing is simply focusing on the referential function of language. If we focus on the expressive and emotive functions of language, then our attention will move to the structure and form of the work of art, and that the structure and the form is what constitutes the aesthetic experience, not the message that is conveyed by the work of art. On this note, let us look at the central tenets of practical criticism. Practical criticism was one of the most influential trends in 20th century criticism. I.A. Richards is considered to be the founding figure of practical criticism. I.A. Richards was during that time a faculty at the Cambridge University. He conducted several experiments with analyzing and examining poetry with some of his very competent students, and he published these experiments in a book titled Practical Criticism and arrived at several conclusions regarding the process of appreciation of poetry as well as prose. Pooja, would you like to tell us something more about the experiment?
Yes. In the year 1920, I.A. Richards, who was a faculty at the Cambridge University, he conducted an experiment. The experiment was that he gave poems and prose works to students to read and then give their views on them. These poems and the prose works that were given to the students, he did not make the students aware of who the author or the poet was, when was that poem or that prose work written, in which country was that particular piece of work composed. His motto behind doing that was that he wanted to encourage the students about what he calls to read literally the words on the page. He wanted that the students should be oblivious of all kinds of preconceived notions that are attached whenever we take a piece of poem or a prose work to read. He wanted the students to achieve an organized response. After the experiment was over, he took responses from the students. When he got the responses, he was surprised that some of the works which were written by well-known writers or poets, they were not well received by the students. On the other hand, some of the poems which were less known to the masses were very well received by the students. So I.A. Richards came to the conclusion that we should look at a work as an individual piece. We should be oblivious of all kinds of preconceived notions, because such notions and stock responses often kill the beauty of that particular work, and they even tend to snatch away the essence that those works have.
So we saw that the word practical has two applications when it comes to practical criticism. One is that refers to a more systematic theory of art, and secondly it refers to applied criticism in the sense of criticism in practice. This is not very difficult to understand if we compare it with the exercises that we engage inside the classroom. Therefore, we are taught how to analyze the poem based on the figures of speech used, or in our tests we often come across comprehension passages where a poem is given to us and then we have to answer certain questions. That is exactly the same thing that I.A. Richards asked the students to do, but in the process he ended up discovering and uncovering the various problems or stages involved in the process of appreciating poetry. Let us have a brief look at these problems. These are called the causes of misreadings of poems. The first is focus on biographical and historical information related to the author. As Pooja mentioned in the beginning, the focus in earlier criticism was on the history of a certain period of time or the biography of an author, and this is how each critic tried to arrive at whether we have truly discovered the meaning that the author was trying to convey. However, with practical criticism, this focus shifts away from the message to the form. The second is the problem of stock responses. How do you think we encounter this problem?
By stock response, we mean that the kind of response that are given to the canonical works that are presented before the readers. Whenever we have works which are canonical, we come up with our own set of responses. I.A. Richards wanted that there should be complete independence whenever a reader reads a poem, rather than looking like a response that has come out of a study of lot of historical background. The responses should be more of what the readers want to convey than what we have in our mind that the poets wanted to convey. This is what he meant by encountering the problem of stock response. He meant that we should have complete independence whenever we are reading a particular piece of poem or a particular piece of prose.
Absolutely. So not to approach poetry with any preconceived notions. The third one is sentimentalism. Sentimentalism refers to the fact that a reader tends to get overtly emotional or sentimental while his or her reading of a work of art, and therefore the appreciation of that work tends to get dominated by one's emotional responses to it, which should not happen, because then one is drawn away from the formal flaws that exist in any work of art. And the final misreading is general critical preconceptions.
General critical preconceptions, it is something that we can even see today. I would like to take the example of a piece of work which is presented to us, and if we are told that this comes as a part of women's writing, we come with a critical preconceptions that this work will either talk about the kind of violence that have been happening to women or the kind of issues that the women have been facing throughout the ages. But if it is a work which something like the work which is written by female Canadian writers, we will come to know that they have got nothing to do with talking about violence or talking about daily domestic habits. They talk about a kind of journey. But whenever we are told that these works are a piece of